Hello, and welcome back to Speak English Daily.
Hi everyone, we are very happy to see you here today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Speak English Daily. I'm Anna.
And I'm Mike. We're really happy you're here with us today. If you enjoy learning English through friendly conversations, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a new episode. We have lots of practical lessons waiting for you.
Mike, I have a question that has been bothering me for a while. Yesterday, I was texting one of my friends, and I wanted to tell her that I didn't get much sleep. I typed, "I hardly slept." Then I looked at it for a few seconds and thought, wait, should it be "I barely slept" instead? I changed the sentence 3 times before I finally sent it.
That made me smile because I know that feeling. You write something, stare at the screen, delete it, type it again, and suddenly one tiny word steals all your confidence.
That's what happened. They're such small words, but they can make you question yourself. I even wondered if both sentences were wrong.
The good news is they aren't. The better news is that you're asking a question that almost every English learner asks sooner or later.
Really? I thought it was just me.
Not at all. Whenever I talk to English learners, someone eventually asks about hardly and barely. They look similar, and sometimes they even seem to mean the same thing. That's why they cause so much confusion.
So today, you're finally going to solve the mystery for me?
We'll solve it together, but we're going to do it differently. We're not opening a grammar book and we're not memorizing long rules. Instead, we're going to use real conversations because that's how these words live in everyday English.
I already like that plan better. I always remember stories more easily than grammar charts.
Most people do. When you hear words in real situations, they become much easier to remember.
Let's go back to my message. If I say, "I hardly slept," what picture comes into your mind?
I imagine someone who got very little sleep. Maybe they stayed awake almost the whole night. They probably feel tired this morning.
That's how I felt. I could hardly keep my eyes open.
Nice! You naturally used hardly again. Now let's try the other sentence. If you say, "I barely slept," I still imagine someone who got almost no sleep. That's why these two words often confuse learners.
So both can talk about sleep?
Yes, they can. But don't worry about trying to memorize every difference right now. As we continue talking, you'll start noticing that native speakers choose one expression more naturally in certain situations.
That already makes me feel less nervous. Sometimes I think I need to understand every grammar rule before I can speak.
You don't. Building experience is just as important. The more natural English you hear, the more your brain starts recognizing patterns without much effort.
Can I test another sentence?
Of course.
Imagine I meet someone at a party. We talk for 2 minutes, and later another friend asks, "Do you know him?" I answer, "I hardly know him." Does that sound natural?
Yes, it does. That's a very common expression. You're saying you know very little about that person.
What if I say, "I barely know him"?
You'll hear that too, and many native speakers use it. That's another reason learners become confused. Sometimes both expressions are possible, but one may sound a little more common depending on the situation. Throughout today's conversation, we'll show you plenty of examples so you can hear the difference instead of simply reading about it.
I love that approach because it feels much less difficult. Instead of trying to remember a list, I can simply listen and notice.
That's the secret. Listen, notice, and practice. Before we move on, here's a question for everyone listening. Which sentence sounds more natural to you right now? I hardly slept, I barely slept, I hardly know him, or I barely know him. Keep your answer in mind because we'll come back to these examples as we continue.
Since we're talking about real situations, let's imagine it's Monday morning. My alarm doesn't ring, I wake up late, and suddenly I'm running around the house looking for my keys. I grab my bag, put on my shoes, and rush out the door. Later, my coworker asks, "Did you eat breakfast?" I'd probably say, "I barely had time for breakfast."
That's a perfect sentence. You're saying there was only a tiny amount of time available. Maybe you drank a few sips of coffee or took one bite of toast, but that was it. I barely had time for breakfast sounds very natural because you're talking about not having enough time.
I know that feeling far too well. When I'm in a hurry, breakfast becomes a banana that I eat while walking to the bus stop.
I've done something similar. I once carried my breakfast with me, then became so busy checking my schedule that I forgot to eat it. I found it in my bag hours later.
That's both funny and a little sad.
It is, but I think many listeners can relate.
Let's move from the morning to the office. Imagine someone asks, "How was work today?" I answer, "I hardly talked to anyone today." That sounds much better than saying, "I barely talked to anyone," doesn't it?
Yes, I hardly talked to anyone today is a very common way to say you spoke to very few people. Maybe everyone was busy, or perhaps you spent the whole day working on one project without many conversations.
I have days like that. Sometimes I look at the clock in the afternoon and realize I've been so focused that I've barely looked away from my computer.
And that's another nice use of barely. You weren't saying you never looked away. You were saying it happened very little.
I think I'm starting to notice something. Instead of asking myself which word is correct, I'm paying more attention to the situation.
That's a smart way to learn. The situation often gives you the answer.
Here's another one. Imagine a student comes home after studying all evening. Their parent asks, "Did you finish your homework?" The student says, "I barely finished my homework."
That's a sentence you'll hear quite often. It tells us the homework was completed but only by a small margin. Maybe the deadline was only a few minutes away, or maybe the assignment was more difficult than expected.
I remember nights like that. I would look at the clock every 5 minutes and think, "Please let me finish before tomorrow."
We've all had those moments. They're stressful while they're happening, but they often become funny memories later.
Now, let's go shopping. You pick up everything you need, walk to the checkout, and then you look inside your wallet.
Uh-oh, that's never a relaxing moment.
You count your money twice because you can't believe it. Then you smile and say, "I barely had enough money."
That's another wonderful example. You had enough money, but only just enough. If one more item had been in your basket, you probably couldn't have paid for it.
I think that's happened to almost everyone at least once.
Especially when prices keep changing.
Here's a different situation. My family has a big dinner every few months, and someone always asks, "Do you spend much time with your cousins?" These days, I'd probably answer, "I hardly see my cousins anymore."
That sounds very natural. You're talking about something that happens very rarely now. Maybe everyone has different jobs, different schedules, or lives in different cities.
It's a little sad when life gets so busy.
It is. Time passes quickly, and before you know it, months have gone by.
One last situation before we move on. Imagine you're on your morning commute. There's heavy traffic, your bus is pulling away, and you start running as fast as you can. You jump on just before the doors close and tell your friend, "I barely caught the bus."
I like that example because people use it all the time. You caught the bus, but only by a second or two. If you had arrived a little later, you would have missed it.
Mike, can I ask you something? Why do you think learners mix these words up so often?
I'm curious to hear your answer first. What used to confuse you the most?
Honestly, I thought they both simply meant almost not. So every time I spoke, I felt like I was guessing. Sometimes I chose the right word, and sometimes I was just lucky.
That's a very common experience. The more real conversations you hear, the less guessing you'll need to do because you'll begin connecting each word with familiar situations.
Before we continue, we'd love to hear from you. Which sentence is more difficult for you? "I hardly ever watch TV," or I barely finished my homework. Tell us in the comments. We'd really enjoy reading your answers.
And don't worry if you're still thinking about it. That's why we're here. By the end of today's conversation, those choices will feel much more natural.
You know, Mike, something else has caught my attention over the years. I've noticed native speakers use certain expressions again and again. Sometimes I hear the same phrase in a movie, then in a podcast, and later in a conversation with a friend. After a while, I start thinking, there must be a reason everyone says it this way.
That's a great observation. Native speakers don't usually stop and think about grammar when they're talking. They simply use the expressions that feel natural. If you learn those expressions, your English will sound much more fluent.
So today we're not learning random sentences. We're learning expressions that people really use.
That's right. Let's start with one you'll hear almost everywhere. Hardly ever.
Oh, I've definitely heard that one. Someone might say, I hardly ever eat fast food.
Perfect example. They don't mean never. They mean it happens very rarely, maybe once every few months. That's why hardly ever is one of the most useful expressions you can learn.
I think that's easier to remember than trying to memorize a grammar rule. I can already imagine people saying it in everyday conversations.
Here's another one. Imagine your best friend calls and says, "Good news, I'm coming to visit next weekend."
I'd probably smile and say, I can hardly wait.
That's a very natural reaction. You're feeling excited and looking forward to something. Native speakers say, "I can hardly wait" all the time when they're excited about a holiday, a concert, a family visit, or even their favorite meal.
I like that expression. It sounds much warmer than simply saying, I'm excited.
It does. Small expressions often make conversations feel more personal.
Speaking of surprises, imagine someone tells me I won a free vacation. I'd probably stare at them for a few seconds and say, I can hardly believe it.
That's another expression you'll hear everywhere. You're saying the news is so surprising that it's difficult to believe it's true.
Hopefully someone surprises me like that one day.
If they do, remember to invite me.
I'll think about it.
That's not the answer I was hoping for.
I'm keeping my options open.
Fair enough.
What about hardly anyone? I hear that one quite often too.
That's another common expression. Imagine you organize a picnic, but the weather suddenly changes. You arrive at the park and discover hardly anyone is there because everyone stayed home.
So it simply means very few people.
That's right. The same idea works with hardly anything. If someone asks, "What did you eat today?" you might answer, "Hardly anything. I was busy all day."
I know a few people who forget to eat when they're working. That's probably something they would say.
Now let's switch to some expressions with barely.
I'm ready.
Last week, I almost missed my train. I looked at the station clock, saw the train arriving, and started running. By the time I reached the platform, the doors were already closing. I jumped inside just before they shut.
Don't leave me wondering, did you make it?
I did, but I barely made it.
That sounds much more exciting than simply saying, I arrived on time.
Because it tells the whole story. Success was possible, but only by a very small amount.
Here's one from my weekend. I stopped at a little cafe to meet a friend. The place was packed. People were talking, coffee machines were making noise, and music was playing in the background. My friend started telling me a story, but I kept saying, sorry, I can barely hear you.
That's a perfect real-life example. The cafe was so noisy that hearing became difficult. You could hear a little, but not enough.
We finally moved outside, and suddenly the conversation became much easier.
Sometimes changing your seat is all it takes.
Have you ever gone shopping and realized you didn't bring as much cash as you thought?
More than once. I remember buying a few things at a local market. When the cashier told me the total, I counted my money twice. I smiled because I barely had enough cash to pay for everything.
That must have been a relief.
It really was. I didn't have much money with me, but it was enough.
Here's another expression I hear quite often. Someone says, the change was barely noticeable.
Good one. Imagine your friend gets a haircut, but only a tiny amount is cut off. You look at them and think, the difference is barely noticeable. It means the change is so small that it's difficult to notice at all.
I like that because it paints a very clear picture.
One last expression before we move on. Have you ever met someone after many years?
Yes, and sometimes I look at them and think, I barely remember your name. It's such an awkward feeling.
We've all been there. You're trying to remember, but only a small part comes back to you. That's why barely remember fits the situation so well.
The more examples we hear, the more these expressions start feeling familiar instead of confusing.
That's the goal. Don't try to memorize them all tonight. Listen for them in movies, podcasts, and real conversations. Before long, you'll start noticing them everywhere, and they'll become part of your own English naturally.
Mike, after listening to all these examples, I'm feeling much more confident, but I have a feeling I'm still going to make a few mistakes when I start using these words in real conversations.
And that's completely normal. Making mistakes is part of learning. In fact, the mistakes we're about to talk about are some of the most common ones English learners make. If you've made any of them, you're in good company.
That makes me feel better already. So I'm going to say a few sentences, and you tell me if they sound natural.
Deal. Let's hear the first one.
I don't hardly sleep these days.
That's a classic mistake. You'll hear learners say it quite often, but native speakers normally wouldn't. The natural sentence is, I hardly sleep these days.
So I don't need the word don't.
That's right. The word hardly already gives the sentence a negative meaning. If you add don't, it becomes a double negative in standard English, and it sounds unusual to most native speakers.
That's interesting because I probably would have added don't without thinking.
Many learners do. They see a negative idea, so they naturally want another negative word. That's why this mistake is so common.
Let me try another one. Imagine I go shopping and I say, I hardly had enough money.
I know why you chose that sentence, but this is where barely sounds much more natural. You'd usually say, I barely had enough money.
Because I had just enough to pay.
That's the key idea. You had enough, but only by a very small amount. That's what barely expresses so well.
I think I understand now. The shopping trip was successful, but only just.
That's a great way to think about it.
Here's another sentence I hear quite often. I barely ever go there.
I can see why that sounds tempting, but native speakers usually say, I hardly ever go there.
I've heard hardly ever so many times today that it already sounds familiar.
That's one reason it's worth learning as a complete expression instead of separating the words in your mind. When you hear hardly ever, treat it like one natural phrase.
That seems much easier than stopping to think about grammar every time.
It also helps your speaking become more smooth because you're remembering an expression instead of building a sentence from scratch.
Okay, here's my last challenge. I hardly finished my homework.
That's another sentence many learners say. If you mean you finished your homework at the last possible moment, the better choice is, I barely finished my homework.
So barely shows that I finished, but it was very close.
That's right. Maybe the class started 1 minute later, or maybe the deadline was only seconds away. You finished, but only just.
I can imagine a student saying that after staying up late.
Or after looking at the clock every 5 minutes.
Mike, can I ask something I've always wondered about?
Of course.
Why do learners make these same mistakes again and again? It can't just be bad luck.
No, there's a good reason. Many learners quietly translate from their first language before they speak English. The meaning makes sense in their mind, but the English expression doesn't always match.
That's true. Sometimes I create the sentence in my own language first, then I try to change each word into English.
Almost everyone does that at some stage. The problem is that languages don't always follow the same patterns. A sentence can be logical but still sound unnatural to a native speaker.
So the goal isn't simply translating words.
Right. The goal is learning how English naturally expresses the idea. That's why we've been using stories and conversations today instead of long grammar explanations.
I like that approach much better. Every example feels connected to real life, so I can remember the meaning more easily.
And here's something encouraging. Don't worry if you make one of these mistakes during a conversation. Native speakers will usually understand what you mean. Then, little by little, you'll begin correcting yourself without anyone reminding you.
That's a nice feeling because it means progress doesn't happen all at once. It happens one conversation at a time.
That's the attitude that helps people become confident speakers. Keep listening, keep noticing natural expressions, and keep practicing. Before long, the correct sentence will come to your mind before the incorrect one ever has the chance.
We've talked about lots of different situations today, so I have an idea. Instead of jumping from one example to another, why don't we follow one busy day from morning until night? Then our listeners can hear these expressions the way they naturally appear in real life.
I like that. That's also how real conversations work. Nobody walks around explaining grammar. People simply tell stories.
Perfect. Let's imagine this day starts with one big problem. My alarm doesn't go off and I wake up almost an hour late. I'm already in a rush before my feet even touch the floor. What would you say?
I'd probably say I overslept. Then a few minutes later, I barely had time for breakfast.
That already sounds familiar. I throw on my clothes, grab a piece of toast, take one sip of coffee, and run out the door.
That's why barely fits so well. You had breakfast, but only a tiny one because there wasn't enough time.
Then I look outside and realize the bus is already coming around the corner. I start running as fast as I can.
I can picture it already.
My backpack is bouncing everywhere, one shoe almost comes off, and I'm waving at the driver. What would you say?
I'd laugh first.
Thanks for the support.
Then I'd say I barely caught the bus.
That's probably what I'd tell my coworkers later.
They'd probably be impressed that you made it.
After I finally arrive at work, I have an important meeting. Everyone looks serious. The manager is discussing a new project, and nobody wants to interrupt.
Those meetings can feel very long.
They really can. I listen carefully, take notes, and only answer one question during the whole meeting. What would you say?
I'd say I hardly spoke during the meeting.
That feels natural because I wasn't completely silent.
Right, you spoke, but only a little.
After the meeting, my desk is covered with work. My inbox is full, my phone keeps ringing, and I still have a deadline waiting for me.
That sounds like one of those days when every 5 minutes feels important.
I keep checking the clock because I want to finish before I go home. The last task takes much longer than I expected.
I know where this is going.
At the end of the day, I finally send the last email.
What would you say? I barely finished my work before the deadline.
That's such a satisfying feeling.
It is. You're tired, but also relieved because you finished in time.
I pack my bag, leave the office, and check my phone.
Let me guess. Another problem?
Of course, the battery is down to 1%.
That's never good.
I still need my phone to check the train schedule and call home.
Then I'd probably say, my phone barely had enough battery.
I'd be hoping it doesn't switch off before I arrive.
You'd probably stop looking at funny videos for a while.
That's a difficult promise to keep.
I understand.
I finally get on the train. I'm so focused on getting home that I'm staring out the window without really paying attention to anything else.
Long days do that to people.
Halfway through the trip, another passenger says, "It's raining really hard outside."
And you look out the window with a surprised face.
Then I say, "Really? I hardly noticed the rain."
That's a wonderful example because the weather changed, but your attention was somewhere else.
I was thinking more about dinner than the weather.
I don't blame you.
After I leave the station, I still have a 10-minute walk home. Every step feels slower than the last one.
You're running on your last bit of energy.
I finally unlock my front door, put my bag on the floor, and fall onto the sofa.
So, what would you say?
Maybe I barely made it home?
That's the expression I'd choose too. It sounds like getting home felt like a real achievement.
Then my family asks if I'd like to watch a movie.
Let me guess. You don't sound very excited.
I smile and say, I'd love to, but I hardly have any energy left.
That's a perfect ending to a very busy day. You still have a little energy, but not much at all.
You know what I enjoyed about that story? We never stopped to think about grammar. We just followed one ordinary day, and the words seemed to appear naturally.
That's one of the best ways to learn. The more stories you hear, the more these expressions become connected to real experiences instead of grammar rules. One day you'll be telling your own story and you'll use hardly and barely without even stopping to think.
You know, Mike, when we started today's conversation, those two little words felt much bigger than they do now. I used to stop and wonder which one sounded right. Now they seem much less frightening.
That's wonderful to hear, because that was our goal from the beginning. We didn't want you to memorize a long list of grammar rules. We wanted you to hear these words in real conversations until they started feeling familiar.
I think that's what made the biggest difference for me. Every example was connected to a real situation. It wasn't just a sentence in a textbook.
That's how language becomes natural. The more you hear expressions in everyday life, the easier they become to remember. Before long, your brain starts choosing the right one without much effort.
Let's finish with a few sentence pairs. I think they're a nice way to bring everything together.
Great idea. Go ahead.
First one, I hardly know him.
That's a very common expression. You're saying you know that person only a little. Maybe you've met once or twice, but that's all.
Now listen to this one. I barely know him.
You'll hear that too, and people will understand it. The important thing is noticing that native speakers often prefer I hardly know him in everyday conversation. The more you listen, the more you'll notice those natural patterns.
Here's another pair. I hardly ever eat fast food.
That's probably one of the most useful expressions we talked about today. Hardly ever simply means very rarely. It's an expression you'll hear again and again.
Now I'll change the situation. I barely ate anything today.
That tells a different story. You did eat, but not very much. Maybe you were busy, maybe you weren't feeling well, or maybe you simply forgot because the day was full of appointments.
I think hearing those two sentences side by side makes the difference much clearer.
I agree. Small comparisons like that help build confidence.
Here's another one. Imagine your friend calls and tells you they won a huge prize.
I'd probably say, I can hardly believe it.
That's such a fun expression because you can almost hear the surprise.
You really can. It shows strong emotion without using difficult vocabulary.
Last one. I barely made it.
Another expression you'll hear everywhere. Maybe someone almost missed a train, arrived just before a meeting started, or crossed the finish line at the very last moment. They succeeded, but only just.
Looking back, it's interesting that these words appeared in so many ordinary situations. We talked about breakfast, work, shopping, trains, family, homework, meetings, and even rainy weather.
That's one reason they're worth learning. They're not fancy expressions that you'll only use once a year. They're part of everyday English.
So, what's the best way to keep improving after today's episode?
Keep your ears open. When you're watching a movie, listening to another podcast, or talking with a friend, notice when someone says hardly or barely. Don't stop the conversation to study grammar. Simply notice the situation. Little by little, those expressions will become part of your own English.
I like that advice because it feels realistic. Learning doesn't stop when this episode ends.
Not at all. Every conversation becomes another lesson if you're paying attention.
Before we say goodbye, let's give everyone one final speaking challenge.
We'd love you to create 2 sentences today. Write one sentence using hardly and another using barely. Keep them simple. The goal isn't using difficult vocabulary. The goal is using each expression in a natural situation.
And don't be afraid of making mistakes. Every confident English speaker has made hundreds of them. The important thing is to keep speaking, keep listening, and keep learning.
That's how confidence grows, one conversation at a time.
Let's leave everyone with one simple idea they can remember after today's lesson.
Here it is. Use hardly most often when you're talking about something that almost doesn't happen or happens very rarely. Use barely when you mean just enough, almost not, or only by a very small amount.
It's amazing how two little words can make your English sound so much more natural once you understand how people really use them.
We hope today's conversation helped you notice those differences and gave you more confidence to use them yourself. Thanks for spending time with us today. Keep listening, keep practicing, and most of all, enjoy the journey of learning English. We'll see you in the next episode.